Welcome everyone. Tonight, I am going to be speaking about a afterlife of Revelation. So this is to talk about one way in which Revelation has been used and interpreted actually from the last few centuries, and it zeroes in on American history. So just Kelly asked me at the beginning when she first saw me, where are you this time? And so the background of my screen, it just so happened that last time that I was talking about a historical context with Revelation, I had the background of the Yale Art Gallery, and I thought, well, I'll just keep it themed. So since today I'm going to be speaking on Revelation and its role in a particular corner of American history, I thought I'd choose the American wing of the Yale University Art Gallery. So slightly themed that way. So today is going to seem like maybe when I first introduced the topic, a little out of left field. But I promise you, I will show you how Revelation has been used in a particular way through American history. So let me just share my screen here. Um, okay. And you will see I'm going to be speaking on apocalypse and American immigration. So you might be thinking, well, we talk about a lot of things having to do with immigration, but apocalypse and the Book of Revelation is definitely not something that we immediately think about when we think about the Book of Revelation. What I am speaking to you about tonight, actually, and this is just a plug, is my own book that just came out last year from Yale University Press in November of last year. It's called Immigration and Apocalypse: How the Book of Revelation Shaped American Immigration. And I'll dive right in right after this to tell you how I pull all these themes together. But just want to speak about a little bit about the cover of the book. On the very top, you'll see the image. And you might recognize it from some of the art that we looked at in the last session a couple of weeks ago when we looked at different illuminations, so different illustrated manuscript commentaries of the Book of Revelation. And this comes from an 11th century illustration of a Beatus of Liébana commentary of the Book of Revelation. And you might be able to guess the scene that's being depicted, which is the judgment of the dead. So at the top, you have both on the left and right hand side angels, and they're holding books and they're seated and they're greeting the dead who are coming to basically be checked to see if they are in the Lamb's Book of Life. And then there's also the books in which their deeds are recorded. So this is that bureaucratic scene in Revelation that shows, when they are their records are being looked at, the celestial database, if you will, and being checked in that way. And on the bottom, you'll see a picture. This is actually in Hidalgo, Texas, when there are migrants seeking asylum and the Custom Border Protection police are on the left-hand side, and there are people seeking entry and asylum into the United States. So this is a juxtaposition of two, I would say, similar dynamics in which we have people hoping to enter a place that has been cast in the Book of Revelation and also in the Book of American History, metaphorically speaking, as a destination and as a particularly godly or heavenly destination. And papers need to be checked. There are checks in other security, defensive walls, etc., that are part of entering the New Jerusalem or entering the United States. And so I look at the broad history of that, and I'm going to sketch out a little bit of that for you tonight. So to begin with, I'm going to take us all the way back several centuries to the 15th century. And this is Christopher Columbus shown in the middle. We just had Christopher Columbus Day, a controversial holiday now in the United States, pass a couple weekends ago, or also Indigenous Peoples Day as well. So some of you may know that Christopher Columbus himself was quite obsessed with the Book of Revelation and also with end times predictions. So he was highly influenced by a Franciscan abbot named Joachim de Fiore, who had made all sorts of predictions and talked about the different dispensations and periods and eras of the world leading up to the end of the world and the coming again of Jesus Christ. And Christopher Columbus himself kept a record, and you can actually look at it today. It's a collection of different prophecies from Hebrew Bible and New Testament and different learnings, including from what Joachim de Fiore is reported to have said and others regarding the end of the world and regarding where paradise might be located. And he gathered these together in what he called a book of prophecies. It was like his notebook of what he believed. Christopher Columbus was subscribed to a point of view of the geography of the world, much like his contemporaries, in that, and you'll see in maps of the world, Mappa Mundi, as they're called in Latin at the time, where you have Jerusalem at the center of the world. And at the top, you have the utter east. And at the bottom, of course, you have the west. And in the east, right, as you sail towards the east, basically up the map, you're headed towards where the traditional understanding of where the Garden of Eden, paradise, was supposed to be located, right, as it's said in Genesis. And what Christopher Columbus believed that he was sailing towards, as you might know, when he took his first journey out westward, right, out of Spain, he believed he was going to find paradise if he kept sailing to the far east, right, going around, navigating the globe. And he sincerely thought he had found paradise, right, when he sighted land. And part of the motivation for this sailing was that he would find this land, paradise. And once he found it, right, if you read in Genesis, right, it describes Eden as having jewels and rich gold and all of these things. And so the idea was you would find this Edenic paradise, find treasures, bring these back to Spain. And he believed that one of the prophecies that had to be fulfilled for the end of the world to arrive was that Jerusalem in Palestine needed to be taken from Islamic power and to be brought back under Christian rule. Because Christ's millennial reign, as is foretold in Revelation chapter 20, was supposed to take place in Jerusalem. And of course, that can only happen if it belongs to Christianity once again, right? So one of his goals was to bring about that prophecy and fulfill it so that he is making Jerusalem once again part of Christendom where Christ would reign. The other prophecy that needs to be fulfilled, part of it you find in Revelation, in which you have all tribes and nations are present, right, worshiping God, which means that there are converts in every tribe and nation. So in sailing to these parts unknown, he would find people who had not yet heard the gospel, they would be converted, right? And that would fulfill the other part. This is also foretold by Paul, right, in which he says the full number of Gentiles needs to be brought in before Israel also is saved, and then the end of the world comes, right? So converting those who had not heard the gospel yet, evangelizing all of them. And the second is to take back Jerusalem. He needs money and funds to do that. So sailing east is going to do that. So the very beginning of exploring for Europe, right, and for the European explorers was framed in this apocalyptic way. And lo and behold, he spots land, right? And the explorers after him also, right, find this vast land and people totally strange to them, flora, fauna, completely new. And it creates this apocalyptic moment of discovery. And it launches a way of thinking about the land that many of us are in right now, right? The United States, this particular piece of land, as fulfilling prophecy in one way or another. So it's framed in an apocalyptic way. And think of the ways that it is named, right? So many new names, like the New Jerusalem in Revelation, right? The New Jerusalem in Revelation could be a title. The new, right, as in New York, right, is also part of its name. So we capitalize it in Revelation, capital N, capital J in the English translation, although it's ambiguous in the Greek because, of course, we don't have capitalized letters in the lower script of the Greek manuscripts that we have. but it could mean New Jerusalem as in a title, or new as just as simply a renewed, right, Jerusalem, or a refreshed Jerusalem as of old. So it is both longing for what was once true, right, what had once belonged to Israel, a memory, a nostalgia, and at the same time, right, hoping for something completely new. And you can think about the United States and our place names and this fulfillment of prophecy for Europe also in a very similar mode of thinking about America, the New World, right? New England, New York, New Amsterdam, New Haven, New Jersey, right? I could go on and on of all these new names. So it's filling a similar desire, I would say, at that moment in history upon discovery. And this carries out throughout American history and then United States history past the Revolution, past 1776. So, for example, where I'm located in New Haven is a great example of this apocalyptic thinking, borrowing from Revelation, borrowing from thinking about the end times and understanding the new world in this way. So, John Davenport, here on the left, is one of the founders of the city of New Haven. He was told by John Cotton, come and join us. You need to be part of this religious movement of the Congregationalists, the Puritans who have come. They have a completely different idea than the Anglicans in England. You know, some of them are exiled. They're coming to seek a new establishment of a new church. And so there's this sense of something new is here where they feel like they're doing what is most godly, most heavenly. And John Davenport is enticed by this, comes, establishes New Haven in 1638. And in his mind, and actually in his writings, he wants it to be as like the New Jerusalem as possible. And in thinking about that, New Haven, the city, in very apocalyptic eschatological ways. And one example of that, very strangely, is the 9 square grid in which New Haven is built. So you can actually still come and visit the city and see how the city is laid out in this particular way. And you'll see in the middle is the New Haven Green, which is one of the largest greens in New England. And urban legend has it, I haven't been able to confirm this through any documentation, but that John Davenport wanted the green to be so large because he felt like it was going to be where the 144,000 were going to be upon to be the elect of God upon the coming of the Son of Man of Christ. I don't have confirmation of that, but we do have is the measurements of the city. And actually the 52 rods measurements of the 9 square grid that you see actually match almost exactly to the measurements of Solomon's temple in Ezekiel. And they also mimic lots of the square formations that you find in Hebrew Bible. So for example, the encampment of the Israelites is square, right? In this particular way in which you have the households, the tribes of Israel around in the center of worship, the tabernacle in the center. It's also described that way in Ezekiel. And then you also finally get to the New Jerusalem, in which you have a perfectly square city with the temple right in the middle. And that's what you have in New Haven. You have the households of New Haven, like the names of the tribes around the walls of New Jerusalem. And in the center, you have the center church on the green, the oldest church now in New Haven, right, established at the time, in the middle on the green. So there's this heavenly apocalyptic urban planning, I would say, right, already built into the bones of New Haven. And part of this thinking of America as a New Jerusalem, as this destination that's going to shine, be righteous, right? This divine American exceptionalism, to couch it and to think about it in that way. You also have examples in the writings of the Puritan fathers like Cotton Mather, who is a descendant of John Cotton and the Mather family. So you have him writing Theopolis Americana, which is basically America's city of God. And he writes about an essay on the Golden Street of the Holy City. And he's equating New England to the holy city, right? Either metaphorically or literally, he makes that equation in which it should be a more righteous place than any other place, and it needs to be a shining example because it is the city of God. So you have this constant conceptualization, identification of America as the New Jerusalem, as either as a metaphor or literally in the bones of a city, or missionally, right? Theologically, it needs to imitate it in that particular way. But it's steeped in this understanding of end times predictions and also a call, right, to be holy, to be pure in this particular way, to be a destination understood as heavenly and God's city. And this bears out through American history, right? Through the Revolution and into the Civil War, you have westward expansion. So we have things like the Battle Hymn of the Republic, right, becoming part of an anthem during the Civil War times. You have soldiers being inspired by fighting for Zion, which is in some ways equated with the United States. Western expansion, you'll see in this painting by John Gast of Progress, in which you have this goddess Liberty traveling to the west, of divine guiding light. So there's God's justification also for this expansion into the west. The removal of indigenous peoples and the bringing of civilization is the bringing of light, right? And so that's understood in that way. We also have understanding and use of both state symbols mixed with, right, religious symbols, understanding of citizenship, very much like is your name in the book of my Redeemer. Yes, my name is written there, right? Christ's account of the faithful in the Lamb's Book of Life here in the centerpiece being used in a particular way. And also, signs of patriotism being linked, right, to the iconography of Revelation and understanding of some sort of heavenly destiny. There is a point in Western expansion in which preachers are talking about, well, we've reached the end, right? We've reached the utter West into California. They've won the war against Mexico, and they've taken Mexican territory as the United States West and Southwest territories. And at that point, right, people are looking for a frontier. And now the project declared by certain pastors and preachers is that we have established the New Jerusalem on earth, and now we must live into that destiny, right? So there's this constant appeal back to Revelation and to the New Jerusalem to think about American identity and mission and conceptualization of who belongs in that particular mode, using Revelation's language, particularly of the New Jerusalem in that way. And I'll draw your attention to one person in particular who talked about it in a specific moment, right? This is Ronald Reagan. This is standing with his back facing the Resolute desk, looking out of the Oval Office. And in January of 1989, he delivers his farewell address to the nation. And he describes the shining city on a hill. So that phrase, shining city on a hill, originally, you might recognize it, comes from Matthew chapter 5, which is part of the Sermon on the Mount, in which Jesus is preaching to his audience, and he says, a city on a hill cannot be hid, right? A shining city cannot be hid. And this is part of where, the truth will come out, or one's faithfulness will come out. It's also used in the 17th century by John Winthrop when he's about to sail into towards America. So one of the first colonialists belonging to Congregationalists coming to America at the time. And so Reagan borrows it. He names John Winthrop as the person who preached about the shining city. And he says, I'm not quite sure, I'm not quite sure if if I've ever described what I saw when I used that phrase. And Ronald Reagan used this phrase more than any other president, the shining city on a hill. And JFK used it once, kind of brought it back into circulation. And then Ronald Reagan uses it many, many times in different speeches. And after Reagan, his imitators, those who want to be, right, the great communicator, the iconic Republican president, pick up that phrase as well. And you can see that through different speeches, I think through every single presidential candidate and president since Reagan has used that phrase at least once, if you look through the database of presidential communications. Anyways, what Reagan describes is very interesting in his speech. And he says, I'm going to describe now what I saw when I say the shining city on a hill. And he basically says, I see a city with strong foundations that is God blessed and windswept. It's tried and true, right? It's shining with a brilliant radiance, and its ports are humming with commerce. And within the city, there's a bustling of people of all kinds. And if there had to be walls and doors, the doors would be open to anyone with the will and the heart to get there. Now, if you've read the description of the New Jerusalem in Revelation chapter 21, you're going to hear a lot of echoes. And I would argue that he is borrowing directly from Revelation in order to describe the United States in his vision. He's positioning himself as the seer, John of Patmos. He sees what looks like the New Jerusalem built on a strong foundation. It is shining, right? Brilliant, like with the radiance of God. It's humming, the ports are humming with commerce, just as the kings of the earth are bringing into the New Jerusalem the wealth, the tribute of the nations. And within it, right, just like there are multitudes of people of all kinds, we also have, the people of every tribe and multitude, as is described in Revelation. And if there are walls, well, there is a huge wall around the New Jerusalem. And if there's doors, the doors will be open. So also almost exactly in Revelation, we have there are gates, but the gates are never shut, right? Because it is always day there because the temple of God is shining within. And so you see, right, echoed piece by piece, the establishment of Reagan's vision of America and the United States as the shining city, echoing exactly parallel to Revelation chapter 21 and the description of the New Jerusalem. What's really interesting is that what Reagan is talking about at that moment is immigration, right? He's saying anyone with the will and the heart to get there can enter, right? And he says, I saw it then and I see it still, right? Shining as a beacon to all the people hurtling through the darkness, right? In this kind of coming towards their last refuge, right? From all the lost places. And so this is this apocalyptic moment of people arriving at the shining city, much as we might imagine, right? All the dead trying to enter into the New Jerusalem. And he's saying anyone with the will and the heart to get there. So you see in Reagan's description, right? This understanding on the one hand, right? A walled city, it's holy, it's shining, it's a destination. The kings are bringing in the wealth into the city, in which there's light and radiance. It's strong. It's right. All its defensive forces are there, but at the same time, it's welcoming, it's hospitable. And then you also have America, shining city on a hill, in an echo, right, of that very passage. So again, this is all in very much mirroring and consistent with the long history of US and the America before that understanding of itself as an apocalyptic place, as reflecting the New Jerusalem as we see it described in Revelation. The thing with apocalypse, though, is that there's another side to it, right? As you know, since you've been with me through these lectures and you've read through the book of Revelation, you have the shining city on the one hand, but there's a whole other narrative that leads up to chapters 20, 21, and 22, right? And in those chapters, we have violence, plague, uh, warfare. We have the burning of the whore of Babylon. We have the four horsemen as they're depicted here coming to wreak vengeance, right? God's justice and vengeance upon all of those who worship the beast. And so the dark side, I would say, of Revelation, and of if you're going to use that metaphor, right, of thinking of America as in shining New Jerusalem, is that what about all the other stuff, right? What about all the narrative that leads up to, sure, you have a wonderful, hopeful ending, right? But you can't just sweep everything else under the rug. And in fact, if you use that metaphor, it's very likely you're going to import that dark side of the analogy into your understanding as well. And this is what it says in Revelation 22. After this glorious description of refuge and the New Jerusalem, outside are the dogs and sorcerers and sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. Some of this language might seem very familiar to you if we're thinking about immigration, right? So if you posit the United States as the New Jerusalem and having that identity, then you might also say those that belong outside, those that need to be kept outside, are these people, right? Are dogs, sorcerers, sexually immoral, murderers, and idolaters. And you can think um, within our understanding and our debates are very heated and polemic and divided in extreme debates about immigration, who we call people that are like dogs, that are equated to being like animals, those who don't worship the same way as some people believe they should, right? And those who are being accused of being rapists, being sexually corrupting, or being violent, or those who are deceitful and criminal, right? Essentially criminal, understood in that way. And so I would say to have the United States be constantly equated to the city of God, the New Jerusalem, is a double-edged sword because it will also cut the other way. It can be used also to exclude and use that language, the violent language of exclusion in Revelation, as well as the shining New Jerusalem vocabulary. So in this way, Revelation, I would say, you can see this be at work throughout American history. So I'm going to give you an example, right? I'll walk you through what's happening at the end of the 19th century going into the 20th century. And this is with the beginning of exclusion, immigration exclusion laws that are the first federally enforced systematic laws starting in 1875 and going into early 20th century, and actually are not repealed until after World War II and then finally reformed again in 1965. But some of this serves as the very basis and foundation of what is our legacy of immigration federal law in the United States. And I would say so much of it utilizes actually language and understanding from Revelation, strangely enough. So we have had waves of immigration exclusion, certainly before 1875. So we have discriminatory practices, social ostracization against the Irish, against Eastern Europeans, against Southern Europeans, and others. But what happens in the 1850s is that there is a need, a vast need in the American West for cheap labor, especially to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And what happens is that immigrants leave China in order to work and bring money back. And so there's an influx of people who are not recognizable to white Americans as European of any extraction, right? And so this is a new flood of people who are coming, right? And actually, it's not a huge number, but it seems huge because they are taking the transcontinental railroad projects and coming into the West to work in the mines, right? There's the gold rush. There are also copper and silver mines in Nevada and other Western territories. And this begins to cause concern and a panic, especially in the US government. What happens is there begin to be debates on the Senate floor, debates against the railroad magnates like Leland Stanford and others who are building these railroads and want the cheap labor to say, you are only doing this for financial gain, but what is this doing to our country, right? So there are definitely white nativist claims, right? By nativist, I mean people who believe that they are the ones who belong and have always belonged in the land, and it should only belong to a certain group of people, namely themselves, right? So you have white nativists who are arguing against this in Congress and using specific language to talk about the Chinese. And much of the language that they're using, right, is that of invasion. And they start using a language of invasion and enemy, and not just of enemy, but particularly of an evil enemy. And starting, this is called the Yellow Peril. And this is, you see this in literature at the time to create this kind of fear amongst society, amongst, to create this anti-immigration movement. And so you have this yellow danger, people being depicted in, semi-demonic ways and coming in an influx that's going to take over, right? And described particularly as idolatrous. So heathen Chinese becomes a regular way to label Chinese. And you understand the language, the vocabulary of those who are idolatrous. And then also here we have the warlord of darkness, right, being used in this demonic way to describe a people who are coming in, which makes sense if you're following the logic of Revelation to think of your own nation, right? To say, if we're God's country and we're going to define ourselves as chosen and draw that upon racial lines and draw that upon lines of how we worship and describe people, then this is a very easy political way to create political movement against these people, to use this particular language. And indeed, the literature and the debates are being used in that particular way. Even using cultural symbols against the Chinese. So, for example, in the center of China via Japan, that pink book cover that you see here, you see the flag and what looks like a dragon, right? And the Qing dynasty at the time, which was ruling China, had the dragon as part of its flag, and that is weaponized and employed in American literature against the Chinese to talk about a demonic presence, right? That this is a worship of Satan, and so therefore they can never become citizens. They can never be assimilated into a Christian nation such as ourselves. And in fact, this is not different, right, than the rules of entry for the New Jerusalem, in which who can enter, right? Only those who are practicing correct worship. We see the letter to the seven churches, you need to do and obey in these particular ways. And anyone who worships the beast, understood as the dragon, right, cannot enter. So you have almost exactly parallel that right of entry defined in these particular ways. You also have the language of the whore of Babylon mixed into this, right? We've talked about um, the way that she's dressed and the ways that she's depicted, very much matching this kind of paradoxical way people are thinking about, quote unquote, the Orient and the East. And this is centuries old, and it still continues today in an exoticization of the East and of Asian and Chinese identity of thinking about, first of all, women coming from China as feminized in a particular way that understand them as sexually corrupting. And also the luxurious goods of Asia and of China, and particularly at the time for Chinese trade, as things like silks, porcelain, teas, all of those things can be a luxury good and at the same time mark Chinese culture out as particularly decadent, opulent, leading to drunkenness, dissipation, use of opium, right? Understood as, they can never be, the strong, masculine Christianity, muscular and clean in a particular way, right? So there's this contrast being set up. And we also, I would say, see that with this contrast and the Whore of Babylon. How is she dressed? She is in purple and scarlet. She's drunken. She's drinking from a goblet of abomination, right? She's also sexually corrupting of the kings of the earth, right, with which she fornicates, right? So this is all of a piece of describing the other in a very particular, orientalized way, and Chinese exclusion, right? Arguments for Chinese exclusion and those particular laws that get passed at the end of the 19th century and the Senate debates actually use these network of vocabulary to make their point, right? They're actually senators who would say in debate, you cannot worship both God and money, right? Money representing China, and God representing the United States. And so you can't, like Leland Stanford would want to employ all these Chinese. The argument is you're only doing this for monetary gain, but is actually un-American and un-Christian to bring in these Chinese because they're going to corrupt us. And in fact, the first federally enforced immigration law is against Chinese women in 1875. It's called the Page Act, and it restricted Asian Chinese women from entering the United States on the assumption that they would come to be prostitutes. So it's that equation of Chinese women as particularly sexually corrupting or being forced, right, by sexually corrupting Chinese men into sexual labor in that particular way, right? So you have that language at work in describing the Chinese immigration population. You also have the Yellow Peril novels that are being used at the time. So for example, Dooner's Last Days of the Republic, one of the first that are being published are these scare novels in which you have Chinese who come to work and then they do things like poison all their employers all at the same time, and they march towards Washington, D.C., and they take over the nation, right? And then they fly this satanic dragon flag over the Capitol. And that's shown as, the beginning of the end, right? In these apocalyptic tones. So this is the enemy entering into God's city. And what does the Christian nation have to do? Of course, it has to prevent immigrants from coming in, right? That's all part of the description to scare people and create a social movement and social unrest against immigrants to pass these laws, which indeed they do. In 1882, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act passed, and it's renewed 10 years later and then strengthened again in the 1904 in the Geary Act. And in fact, with the Geary Act, we have the requirement of documentation for the first time, right? That Chinese need to show that they are here only temporarily or doing business. They are not laborers. They are not, XYZ. They can only be students. Otherwise, they can be kicked out. And so we begin with this language and vocabulary of exclusion, borrowed, I would say, using the tactics of revelation, leading to what have become assumed natural parts of our immigration process: papers, documentation, photographs, all of these things, right? Begin the bureaus, that the offices that are created to make sure that these laws are followed at different points of entry along the West, specifically in Angel Island. All of these things are established during Chinese exclusion, right? And so the very idea of illegal entry really begins at this time, because we have these federally enforced qualifications and to carry papers. So undocumented becomes a thing around this time. So it's all actually fairly new, but it's coming at a moment that becomes a blueprint for the language and vocabulary that we see used again and again, using this very politically expedient vocabulary that we find in Revelation. So we also have the use and like I've said, of the dragon in Chinese culture, which has nothing to do with, fire-breathing satanic destruction, but rather is associated with the emperor and with rain and blessing, being used to say this is the snake of Satan, right? And so I'm just showing you another yellow peril novel here, History of Taking of California and Oregon by the Chinese. There are lots of such things being written at the time to create this kind of fear. Here's an example of a cartoon of Uncle Sam, right? Aiming his cannon, ready to be at war, like Archangel Michael, looking at this fire-breathing, smoke-breathing dragon of the East, right? And so we have Uncle Sam and his white sailor whites, and he has the stars on his back, looking towards this dark, demonic-looking dragon. We also have something like this. This is in Europe, also looking at the yellow peril at the time. And here you have Archangel Michael pointing to the east. This is mostly fomenting fear against Japan at the time, also a growing economic and political power. And of course, we have represented the European nations as these Romanesque goddesses with different symbols. You'll see, the Union Jack, right, the flag of the United Kingdom, with one of the soldiers, and you can recognize some of the other possibly also associated with different European nations. And Michael's pointing to the Buddha, who is seated like the Whore of Babylon upon a beast, right? Upon the dragon looming over the dark east. And of course, representing the European nations is the gleaming white cross. So this is part of the iconography borrowed from Revelation. You have Michael leading his angels to war against the satanic angels and Satan, to win finally that battle in heaven. And so we have all of this to describe this great fear, right, against different peoples, especially within US immigration. I'm just going to go through the last couple of slides and we can go into questions. And I could talk a lot more about how this relates to the rest of American immigration up to the present and including the present time. But we have also the association of Chinese with eating what's disgusting, right? There's also the eating of disgusting things in the Book of Revelation, in which people of Whore of Babylon is going to eat, right, the witnesses of Christ and drink the blood of the saints. And also we have Chinese seen as a pest. They're animals. They also must go, right? Like this rat poison, that the Chinese about to eat a rat, also going to be poisoned, but they're equated with disease and plague. So here are the Chinese described as a plague of locusts, much like we have a plague of locusts in Revelation, and they're described as like grasshoppers with faces like human faces. And this image seems directly plucked out of that particular passage with famine, right? Also the green horse coming, here a demonic figure with the cord of whips driving this plague into the United States, crossing Uncle Sam's poor immigration policy, right? That little fence that's barring the way. Also the ghosts of plagues haunting Chinatown as associated with Chinese, especially leprosy pouring out this plague onto Chinatown, and bravely in the middle, representing, the stalwart American spirit, of course, is the Christian church and the cross. So there are many such images, as opposed to, right, thinking about the cleanliness of the city, those who have washed their robes and wearing white robes and can take part of the river of life. Um, so we have all of these images. I'm gonna leave a couple slides, but we see this bearing out, right? Also within the the use of the equation of people with animals, with being a pest, with being dirty, a connection of these network of languages being used in Revelation, and then contrasting that with what is pure, what is clean, what is truly American, in a particular way. So associating those who are outside with animals, with disease, and not just Chinese, but with waves of immigrants coming later, right? So with Mexican laborers and associating them with typhoid and actually making them bathe at the border, which is a thing that happened right through the Braceros program. When they came to labor, they had to get bath tickets, like literal bath tickets to enter the United States, the New Jerusalem, right, to wash their robes. Associating Italians with tuberculosis or Irish with cholera, right? This is an age-old tactic. And then most recently, of course, we can think of COVID and first the anti-Asian hate that came with that, but then moving that blame to the southern US border and blaming caravans of those coming from Latin America for a particular strain of the virus as well. Beyond that, also, I can think of the nexus of other things of accusing those who don't worship the same as us is particularly part of anti-Islamic fear that's being drummed up. Also thinking about the language of invasion and expulsion, and thinking of the nation as particularly Christian and needing to fight against invasion in this particular way, wanting to send a hellfire rocket, right, using those particular words to the border, and then also the border itself, the border wall, being described as even heaven has a wall around it, right? Is the latest of the last decade of using that as justification for building a border wall, still using Revelation's language of New Jerusalem to frame justification for how immigration policy happens. And so that's a very quick snapshot of just some of the parts of my own research and thinking about the way Revelation is afterlife of how it's being used in the history of American immigration, all the way from discovery, European discovery, to the present day and our current political situation, and talk about immigration and immigration policy.